Welcome to the Next Gen Marketing Podcast, where we feature top execs and influencers blazing new trails in consumer engagement, content strategy, digital media, and brand design. And now, here's your host, Andrei Najjar.
Over the past 20 years, Ash Karbafrushan has helped build two of the most successful content brands in the consumer web space. First, Ask Men, and now WatchMojo, of which he is currently CEO. As a seasoned writer, Ash has authored over 1,000 articles on subjects including management, business, relationships, history, sports, pop culture, and entertainment, and has interviewed hundreds of newsmakers and celebrities. In this episode, I chat with Ash about his entrepreneurial background and his recent investment in Livestream commerce company Livescale, an industry already doing over $230 billion in China and set to do over $500 billion globally over the next 3 years. In this episode, we chat with Ash about his tips on product innovation, the importance of self-awareness and leadership, and the exciting world of Livestream commerce. Enjoy the episode. Ash, thank you so much for being on the episode. We are so excited to have you. And I'd love it if you could kick off the episode just by talking about your entrepreneurial background. You've been involved in so many amazing things.
Sure. I mean, I was born in Iran and then I moved to Canada when I was very young. So I grew up, very much into pop culture. And I think I was just absorbing everything that I was reading and watching. And by the time I finished college studying finance, I kind of realized I didn't want to do like an investment banking career. And I liked the startup world. And it wasn't just any startups. I realized I really like media and content. And I kind of was like your prototypical, entrepreneur storyteller. And so I worked at a company called Ask Men, where I was like writing columns and doing a lot of business deals. And then I got the entrepreneurial bug at 27. And that's basically when I started WatchMojo to cover pop culture, but told through like a video storytelling lens.
Yeah, you guys were definitely innovators with that. I'd love to hear more about how you came up with that format because, WatchMojo sort of kicked off in a lot of ways. It was part of the early days of like entertainment content.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we started, I actually wanted to do a video on every topic, not quite Wikipedia encyclopedia tone. It was kind of marrying cable TV with, a consumer magazine in video. But what we realized very early was, we couldn't be everything to everybody. Ultimately, when you're a brand, you have to stand for something. And I realized, if somebody watched a travel video on a Monday and a cooking video on a Tuesday, and then they saw a top 10 list on movies on the Wednesday, it would be confusing. So I would say we basically, Michael Milken, the legendary investor, says that the best investors are social scientists. So I basically spotted 4 trends. One was that YouTube was going to just take over the world. It was clear that YouTube was going to become this dominant platform with every video ever practically. So I said, look, you got to go fish where the fish are. 2, I said kids who grew up reading comic books are now basically decision makers on Madison Avenue, Hollywood, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley. So they're going to be bringing this so-called geek culture of Batman and Spider-Man into their everyday affairs. And so we said we want to basically serve fans of those universes. 3, I was actually comfortable with copyright and fair use. And because we had these relationships with rights holders, for us, it was kind of normal to not just have like a guy sitting on a couch talking about why he loved Seinfeld, but actually show scenes from Seinfeld or show, clips from music videos and so on. And at the time, that was really, really edgy and unique on YouTube because that wasn't really on the platform. And then last but not least, I said, you know what, we got to have a format. We did not invent top 10s, Letterman, Wayne's World, Moses, Moses and the 10 Commandments himself. I was like, this is a format that mankind's always been drawn to. So we really made a bet around those 4 things. And, we were obviously, I think, smart. We had a great team, but we were very lucky and timing always matters. So we kind of caught lightning in a bottle.
How did you guys decide on some of your first pieces of content? Like, how did you move into, like, did you start off with like sort of the geek culture vertical or like what led the initial content choices?
Sure. So frankly, I started off kind of like eating the dog food. So I said, what are some topics that I'm really well versed in, whether it's like 80s hard rock or electronica or rap, or I was like, look, if I'm into certain movies, i.e. 1994 movies, Forrest Gump, Shawshank Redemption, and Pulp Fiction, if it was like topics that I was well versed in, I felt like I could create videos and kind of make sure that they were really of high quality, because if you're going to put your neck out there and say these are the best 10 entries of a given thing, you better make sure you know what you're talking about. But very quickly, I realized, again, like our statement of purpose being here to serve, and our vision is to inform and entertain, and your mission is what changes over time. Your mission is what supports that vision. So for us early on, we did want to have a video on every topic, but eventually we were covering kind of pop culture. And then people were just requesting videos. They were like, hey, why don't you do these videos on anime? Or why don't you go really deeper, not just covering Batman, but Ant-Man? And I remember going, Ant-Man? So I really had to go out there and recruit these. It was like I was looking for these unicorns, so to speak, people who were really passionate about topics, but they could also be objective. Like I love, just for example, hard rock, right? But I could still differentiate if a given artist should be number one because they had better commercial success or they were more respected by critics than what I wanted. And it wasn't about our list being an individual's top 10. It was really representing, kind of capturing pop culture history in these short and sweet, 5-10 minute videos that would give you like a glimpse into that topic and almost make you an expert in all these different areas.
It's interesting. I mean, you guys have really grown quite a bit with YouTube, I would imagine. And I'm sure that, the business model has changed. I mean, I'm looking at your page. You guys have, close to 24 million subscribers and over 19,000 videos, which is amazing. How have you guys evolved with YouTube's evolution?
Well, that's a great question, because there's what happens and then what happens kind of behind the scenes. So, I mean, look, I would say the most important thing is we played a big part in kind of defending fair use on the platform. We knew the law, we were respectful, and we kind of, I don't want to use the word lobby, but we did kind of articulate clearly like, hey, this is the law. You are interpreting it and applying it in a certain way, which is your right, but then you can't pretend to be a neutral platform. So if you want to be a neutral platform and kind of benefit from the DMCA for safe harbors, why don't you follow through and stay neutral with regards to copyright? And that was kind of like a very sound legal argument, but it could have backfired, right? They could have said, screw you. So I think that was the biggest kind of thing that we did behind the scenes. But then, on the surface, obviously, when we were, a challenger, we were pushing the envelope with regards to topics. And then as we became kind of more of like an established brand, we did have to kind of lead by example. So with things like brand safety, we couldn't just do whatever topic we wanted. We had to make sure that we kind of strive for, setting the best practices on the platform.
Absolutely. What has been some of your highest engagement content? I mean, obviously you guys are sort of famous for your top 10 and top 20 lists. Is there a certain content category that you find the engagement's higher?
Absolutely. I mean, unfortunately on the internet, things that have a bit more of a critical negative tone
do
better. And we don't like that. But if we were to we still try to always serve the fans. So even if we're going to be critical, it's more lighthearted. It's not like TMZ, savage, takedown type of thing. But then, look, I would say that movies, TV shows have really grown in popularity, and gaming as well, over the last decade.
Yeah, definitely.
But definitely the whole Marvel universe and the same things. We basically became a barometer. We became a barometer of the things that fans were really passionate about. So whether it was Game of Thrones, whether it was the MCU, we kind of, without wanting to be these tastemakers or curators, we effectively were covering all the things that fans were really passionate about. And this explosion of Netflix and Paramount Plus and HBO Plus and this kind of redrawing of the map where Disney blows up its business and says, hey, we're going to go direct to consumer, we've basically been like at the, we've had a front row seat to that revolution.
Right. What is the revenue model? Like, do you guys do brand partnerships? I mean, obviously you have AdSense and all the YouTube metrics, but like, how do you guys work with brands?
So we get a lot of brands that reach out to us and they want to either sponsor videos that are a bit more arm's length, or they will want us to create more branded content. So for example, a few years ago, Universal Pictures, they asked us to recreate a Rube Goldberg machine, a chain reaction machine of Jurassic Park. And it was to kind of promote Jurassic World in the theaters. So we do generate a lot more revenue just from AdSense, which is obviously great because it allows creators like ourselves to kind of just cover topics that we want and not be so worried.
Right.
But at the same time, like I'm not, as an entrepreneur, as an executive, I like brands. I like marketing. I think, going back as a student of history and a student of business and all that, advertising has effectively underwritten all this awesome information going back hundreds of years. So, for me, whenever we sit down with a marketer and figure out, what is it that they're trying to accomplish, what are their challenges, we tend to do good work because, it's kind of maybe because we're Canadian and we're kind of nice and diplomatic. We don't we obviously separate church and state. Like we would never say, oh, just because Kraft wants to do a partnership with us and all of a sudden, one of their brands is going to be number one. Like we're never going to do stuff like that, but we could definitely kind of work with a marketing department to come up with ways that audiences would kind of greet, editorial that does ultimately serve the marketer's objectives, but is also like on its own feet, really compelling content that's informative and entertaining.
Absolutely. Speaking about sort of the entrepreneurial angle of things, you had posted on your LinkedIn, I think it was about 5 days ago, that in some ways WatchMojo succeeded because I ran out of dead ends. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure. So, I mean, look, when we launched, first of all, out of the gates, content was not in vogue. So every investor I spoke to was they were like, we do content bets. I was like, what kind of content bets? They're like, we invest in a company like YouTube. I was like, no, that's a platform to upload content. So out of the gates, content was not exactly in demand. And then frankly, it was frivolous and meritless, but my old company sued me, accusing me of violating my non-competition, which wasn't actually the case. But so that also was like a huge obstacle early on. And then look, the history of YouTube, there was no revenue, so to speak, on like online videos. So we didn't, we lost money for 6 years. I didn't pay myself for 6 years. I always joke that it's amazing what can happen in year 7 if you're willing to go 6 years without a paycheck. But that's kind of what happened. And then ultimately, I think I could see as a user, as a consumer, that YouTube was going to be ground zero for media consumption. But if you were a media executive, you hated YouTube. YouTube, I wrote an article in 2011 saying that YouTube has already gone from being the pariah to the belle of the ball, but nobody's really noticed it. So I do think it's like, we stuck to our guns with regards to storytelling and video content, but we did tinker, we did iterate, and it's kind of like we tried a lot of stuff, but then the answer was pretty clear in front of us, and it goes back to those 4 bets I mentioned earlier on.
Yeah, and I mean, Ash, kudos to you for seeing the future of YouTube, because I remember even when it came out, I was like, well, why would people want to create content on this? But there was something there, and it was sticky from the beginning. And, sure enough, it's the belle of the ball. That said, I'd love to shift gears a little bit on another bet that you've placed recently on Livescale. And I want to hear all about this. I know that live stream commerce is a huge passion point for myself and my community. Tell us a little bit about Livescale.
Sure. So Livescale was a company based in Montreal, started by a French entrepreneur that I got to meet through one of my colleagues. And, we are ultimately, if you think of the 3 C's of the internet, you got content, commerce, and community. And WatchMojo is obviously a content play, and it's got a thriving community, whether it's the Mojoholics or the passerbys who check out our content as they're, and not necessarily watching every video. There's a lot of, we obviously cover topics. So the star of our channel is the underlying topic, and we're blessed for that. But it's not like we are a commerce behemoth, right? It's not like it's our sweet spot. So as I was speaking to the founder, Virgile, I thought that the future of commerce would not necessarily be always live or social, but it would be increasingly live and increasingly social for one. And then two, I felt like if we were ever going to lead on an investment, like I studied finance in another life, I could have probably become an investor or an analyst or something not in media. I just felt like, if I ever was going to, through my investment vehicle, invest in a company as the lead investor, the fact that this was a company in my backyard, I knew of the company for a while, and it was something like commerce where I had complementary skills, but I knew that I could, add value as an entrepreneur, but learn a lot as well. It just for me seemed like a very natural bet. And I always go that it's very easy to have more of a herd mindset when you're an investor. But
Absolutely.
I did want to, yeah, for sure. And it's understandable. But I did just feel that this was one of those things that regardless of the specific execution, you ultimately at that stage, you're betting on an entrepreneur and you're really betting on a big market and you're hoping that they kind of connect or find that product market fit, or in content I call platform format fit. So it was just a very bullish, just sentiment that in the end, this was going to be a market and an opportunity that would only grow over time. The same way that I came across YouTube early on and just felt like, you really almost have to go out of your way to miss for this to become successful.
What global markets does Livescale focus on?
Livescale is, I think, mainly North America,
Okay.
but because one of their main partners is L'Oréal, they obviously do have a big presence in Europe, and I am starting to work with them to establish some partnerships and alliances with Asia, although admittedly, the irony is a lot of the consumer behavior that companies like Livescale are betting on is for audiences in North America to adopt some of the practices in Asia, which I don't necessarily think is is accurate. I don't think that assuming that the way people buy stuff and consume stuff in other markets will carry over here. But if the market is still big enough and it's early enough, there's still more than enough wind in your sails to be able to grow a business.
Yeah, I mean, just to give my audience some statistics, I did a little bit of research prior to the podcast. In China, they're saying that the live stream commerce market is up 453% in the last 3 years. So that's a $230 billion industry. Some companies get up to 80% of their revenues off of live stream commerce. The biggest player is Taobao Live, which is owned by Alibaba. And they're projected to do over $500 billion in transactions over the next 3 years. So, I think to your point, Ash, this is why the US and the Canadian and North American markets are so interested in this model, because even if it doesn't explode to be those levels of commerce, there's still something there.
Absolutely. And I mean, a few years ago, I think companies like Beyond the Rack and Guild Group, they started to experience a little bit of traction, but they were really ahead, right? It's the same way that WatchMojo was in the third wave of content producers, but people think we were early. I felt we were late compared to the first and second wave, But so it's the same concept here. I feel like especially with the pandemic, there's just going to be this acceleration of these trends. And I feel like the mistake some investors make is they feel, well, unless North America consumer behavior mimics Asian consumer behavior, then this won't be a success. I'm like, that's not really the case, because it is a different market, but it's also less cluttered, right? And so,
exactly.
Yeah.
What do you think are going to be some of the factors that are going to help turn the light switch on in the US? Do you think they're going to be platform based? Because, when you look at the gaming platforms like, Travis Scott's concert, Fortnite, that sold the most concert tickets of any concert. There's clearly an architecture happening in the metaverse and the gaming spaces. But what light switches do you think we're going to need to see from social media platforms or other platforms for this to really start to pick up in the US?
I think it's mainly a demographic dynamic, which is with teens becoming more and more, mobile devices. It's kind of a second nature, like they grow up with a phone. That's one thing. Two, I think a lot of parents do try to educate financially their children. And I think you're seeing that in the fintech revolution. So for me, I just feel like for kids who don't view a video game differently than a music song and don't see it that differently than a TV show, for them, there's just this expectation to be able to consume, create, curate, share. And that's, I think, one reason why gaming has exploded so much because the gaming rights holders have been a bit more open to at first reluctantly, but to ultimately let mashup culture take on. And that's, I think, the explosion of things like Let's Play and PewDiePie.
Mm-hmm.
So if you were to think of why I feel things like Livescale will grow and why I think live shopping will grow, it's because there is this dynamic of concurrent social being in the moment and making, whether it's impulsive or leaning on others to make shopping decisions. So for me, I think the biggest catalyst is probably demographics, this generation of teens who will grow up with mobile devices, connected to, and also a higher propensity to buy stuff online. For the first 10 years online, I felt like, well, I can't buy anything online. Everything should be free online. So to me, it's mainly demographic. I don't think the catalyst will be technology or anything like that. It's a different mindset. This feels much more natural to a 13 and 14-year-old than it does to a 33 or 43-year-old.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great point. I wanted to ask you a question about platforms. Is Livescale a model where it could either API or white label onto existing social media platforms with a point of commerce? Or do you guys primarily operate within an app-like format?
So, I don't want to speak on behalf of the founders, the executive team. So let me word it more this way.
Okay.
I feel like Virgil and his team have done a pretty good job to iterate and connect, let's say, client partners like L'Oreal with platforms like Shopify, and building a presence on a Shopify. My Lord, when I hear him talk, I'm like having PTSD flashbacks to me figuring out YouTube. No, seriously, I mean it. You're building on somebody else's farm. And again, to a more traditional executive, that's like horrible.
Right.
But I go, look, if you build a big business and your distribution point is through Walmart, that's not a bad thing. Where I see he will have to make a big decision, and you alluded to it, is the way that YouTube, I joke that WatchMojo was the house that YouTube built, and before other platforms like Facebook and now Snap and TikTok and all that emerged to be viable number twos, I think it's more a reflection of, are there going to be other platforms and other ecosystems that are going to be large enough and compelling enough? If the answer is yes, then to an entrepreneur who ultimately weighs his or her opportunity cost, they will probably gravitate more to just building on these other platforms. If, however, they're like, oh, well, look at this. We've really fine-tuned our offering, and the people that we open this up to, whether it's a client, whether it's a store, whether it's whomever, an individual, whatever, that's case by case, they really seem to run with it, and this scales, and it's profitable, the unit economics make sense. I feel then that might make sense to kind of fully open up and view yourself more as a white label API. But that's one of the reasons why I actually love supporting entrepreneurs, because I was in the trenches for a while. You suffer from tunnel vision. It's hard. I don't underestimate how much luck and timing played in, my success. False modesty aside, I say we're the unknown startup nobody's heard of, but that's obviously not true when you reach 150 million people. So that's the high I get, which is seeing entrepreneurs trying to figure that out, and me kind of just being a shrink, helping them not lose their minds.
What are some of those characteristics? You said, I thought it was very interesting that a good investor is investing in people, more so than just even the idea. What are some of those characteristics that you look for in who you'd invest in from an entrepreneurial standpoint?
Well, let's start with the formula that I find for success as a startup and as an entrepreneur. I think you need 1, vision, 2, ambition, 3, execution, 4, persistence, 5, luck, 6, timing, 7, focus, and 8, I added this during the pandemic, resilience.
Oh, yeah.
So those are really, and I started tracking that in like when Facebook did its IPO for TechCrunch. TechCrunch, I was writing for them. They said, hey, could you write something about Mark Zuckerberg? And I said, sure. So, but I think that is what I look for in an entrepreneur, because there is no such thing as an overnight success. My third book is called The 10-Year Overnight Success, an Entrepreneur's Manifesto, and it's about the WatchMojo and YouTube story. So that's what I look for. But in terms of that's what you need, I feel, to succeed. Now, in terms of an entrepreneur, look, entrepreneurs are like very weird, unique individuals who are both like masochists, who have it's true. I say entrepreneurs are masochists, executives are sadists. And I think that is quite true. But in any case, and then the other thing that you do need is I hate to admit it, you need a chip on your shoulder. there is something, we're all driven by insecurities, whether it's good or bad, whether it's conscious or subconscious. There is something, a desire to help, a desire to give back. For some people, it's I want a bigger house. For some people, it's like I want money, I want a nicer car. Whatever it is, my parents didn't love me, my dad didn't pay enough attention. We're driven by these weird things. But an entrepreneur, the most pure, ultimately successful entrepreneurs do have that kind of servant leadership, selfless. They're not in it to be near-term greedy. If anything, only long-term, they want to maybe get some kind of financial or material gain. And they're not even driven by that. So you're kind of like trying to solve a problem that most people don't even realize is a problem. The same way that I saw YouTube and I said, YouTube is going to crush the entire universe. It was very clear to me. And some of it actually, ironically, had to do with their willingness to take on piracy risk. They were very aggressive with the DMCA early on compared to some of their peers. And that was one of the many reasons that I said, well, look, if this platform is going to be okay leaving SNL's Lazy Sunday or a Comedy Central clip until it's forced to take it down, I was like, well, that's going to attract a lot of eyeballs. And then people who produce content that's related to that, they're going to end up kind of benefiting, right? And that's one of the reasons why we focused on music, not just because I was a huge music fan, but because I was like, well, wait a minute. If there's no Beyonce music video and we do top 10 Beyonce music videos, our video will stand out, right? So I think entrepreneurs are basically, they're restless, they're masochists, they want to serve, they want to solve a problem, and they want to prove people wrong. So when I see those traits in people, I'm like, okay, this person is going to tough it out, and they have what it takes.
I think those are really amazing psychological insights, only because we've had quite a few entrepreneurs on the show. And then I also grew up in a family of successful entrepreneurs. And I think you're absolutely right. There's almost like a thorn that they're driving against. And then when you mentioned status for corporate leaders, I need to think about that one because a lot of my clients are corporate leaders. But yes, I think that would probably be accurate as well.
Well, yeah, because look, and I'm not blaming anybody. Everybody has a journey. Everybody has a struggle. Entrepreneurship is a privilege. Like I was very lucky. I was not born on third base by any means. Am I a self-made person in some ways? But there's many shoulders I stood on. But ultimately, I fundamentally think that I'm always trying to eradicate people's pain. I'm always trying to make people comfortable. Whereas, let's be candid, in the corporate domain, you do need to ultimately be a bit more political. Of course. You do need to be a bit more like, hey, maybe this is the nice thing to do. But I'm not going to do that because I got to teach you a lesson and I got to step on you to get ahead. An entrepreneur is very different. I didn't pay myself for 6 years. That was a privilege. I'd made a little bit of money in my previous gig. But it doesn't change the fact that not that many people are willing to do that, right? And it's a very different set of thinking, and it doesn't make me better or worse than others. It just makes me different, and we're all different, right? But entrepreneurship today has become this thing where kids don't want to be doctors, they don't want to be lawyers, they effectively don't even want to be bankers or hedge fund managers or venture capitalists. They want to be entrepreneurs because they've grown up watching Mark Zuckerberg on the social network. They grow up and now they're watching Elon Musk, and they're like, hey, I want to be that. But it's like every kid wanted to be Michael Jackson when they were a kid. Every kid wants to be Michael Jordan, but most of them can't. So I don't necessarily think that like everybody wanting to be an entrepreneur is necessarily healthy, but it's fantastic for people to pursue it because, there's that saying, entrepreneurship is living a few years of your life like few are willing to be able to live the rest of your life like few can. So if you're willing to put in the pain, you might get a gain, but it's might. There's no guarantee.
What do you think about that deification of entrepreneurs? There's almost like a fetishism in U.S. culture now, especially with the generation that grew up with the Steve Jobs and the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world. There's a lot of conversation around that now, and even when looking at pending government regulation, like what do you think about that like persona creation of the entrepreneur?
Okay, great question. So let's go back if you want to start specific. Sure, in the last 10, 15 years with things like Shark Tank on ABC, with like Gary Vee being everywhere, and I don't knock him. Gary Vee, to some, he's like, they kind of find him to be almost like a comical character. But I'm like, let's be fair. The guy took over his father's wine business, built it into this much bigger thing, and then went out and did all this stuff. But sure, he kind of went out there and talked about it. There's a lot of entrepreneurs who are just in the trenches building it. But yes, so I think you do see this mainstreamification of entrepreneurship. But absolutely too much of a good thing is bad. And yeah, we are now seeing, these big tech platforms. I feel the biggest missed opportunity was how 15 to 20 years ago, when all these venture capitalists had all these billions of money under management, many of them basically, I feel, abdicated their true leadership. A great investor would tell Mark Zuckerberg, hey, I'm going to give you this money and you're going to go out there and you're going to make a lot of money for yourself. You're going to make a lot of money for me. But with this money and this power comes responsibility. And okay, you got to kind of balance all stakeholders' needs. That I feel was not done. And that's why I feel when you watch things like Facebook and Twitter and the abuse and the intimidation and just like the vitriol, I think it's because we kind of went and said we are going to go and pray in the church of money, so to speak, and the church of fame. And I feel like throughout the last, 10, 20, 30 years, maybe people who are principled have taken a back seat to people who've been driven by profit. I think what's happening now, and I covered this actually in my documentary called Fox in the Hen House, I think one of the reasons why so many younger voters were drawn by socialism, and even billionaires are coming out now saying, hey, wait, capitalism is not really working the way it should, is because you do need a bit more balance. You do need to care about all stakeholders. I'm not saying you need to care about every stakeholder in the same weight, but anybody that just thinks of shareholders 100%, well, that's not sustainable, right? That system is going to break. So I think what you're seeing now is an opportunity, and the pandemic exacerbated this, and the Black Lives Matters, long overdue, the Me Too movement, right now the Stop the Asian Hate movement. Like there's the Muslims are going to, I was born Muslim, by the way, that's why I could say this, even though I'm as Muslim as a BLT, I feel the Muslims are going to come out pretty soon.
Of
the
course.
Muslims are going to come out pretty soon and say, hey, after 9/11, we were kind of like, unfairly criticized and discriminated against, and we've never had a day of reckoning. And I think America, it is the greatest nation in the world when right. Unfortunately, America at its extremes creates all this inequality. So one thing that drives me a lot is say, hey, look, 15, 20 years ago when I started my business, I was talking about all these things about conscious capitalism, more equality, more justice, fairness, et cetera, et cetera. And you mentioned this earlier when you picked up on psychology. I said, today you're seeing all these billionaires get on that train and say, yeah, capitalism could do better. Today, I'm telling everybody, go back and open those social science and humanities textbooks. Because if you want to be successful, you have to manage people. And if you want to manage people, you have to understand what's going on between their heads. We in North America do not talk about, hey, what trauma did you go through when you were a kid? What are the issues you're having at home that are affecting you at the workplace? We don't talk about that. It's taboo. I actually feel like in the 2020s, especially coming out of a pandemic where people have not even managed their emotions yet, they're not even coping with the loss. I think that is going to be the big thing, where the best leaders and the best marketers are going to be those who understand that what is going through in your mind, which is a function of what you've experienced, explains why you show up and you're like LeBron James versus somebody who is just an asterisk in the history of that company's evolution.
I'm so happy that you bring up this notion of self-awareness and leadership, because I think what we've been seeing in the media and what we're teaching kids is, to your point, this sort of worship of money. But, when you look at a lot of these people's stories, there's not necessarily a lot of fulfillment. I think that's coming out more and more, especially when you look at, what unfortunately happened with recently with the Zappos CEO. But, I think in general, this idea of self-awareness, I think that's very evolved of you to say, because I think that you can't quite help other people if you're running away from something, and it's of no fault to other people. I mean, we all have our own issues, but I think that's a key ingredient that people don't talk about.
Yeah, we had everything's relative. So we had tremendous retention at the company. The same 5 co-founders, including myself, are still there, one of whom is my spouse. So the fact that she still lives with me and works with me tells you everything about temperament and balance. But we also have the core of 10 employees who've been with us for 10 plus years. But, the reality is when we kind of grew really rapidly and we hired so many young kids, some of them just didn't fit in, some of them left. But one conversation of note stuck with me. When one individual was leaving the company, I kind of said, hey, let's just chat. If there's anything I could do, let me know. I said, look, I know occasionally we didn't agree on everything, but I want you to know I appreciate what you did, yada, yada. But at one point I said, look, I do want to say something to you, and I don't want to never say this because I go, it's going to prevent you from having more success at your next stop. I'm like, you never really communicated. And I was like, do you understand how you hurt yourself in your development? I go, I kind of feel like I'm always asking people, I'm like, here's a poll, here's a survey, talk to me, talk to your manager. And this person said it. The person said, look, I've had this kind of obstacle to communicate with, whether it's siblings, whether it's, significant others. It shouldn't be a surprise that it also kind of carried over into the workplace. And at that moment, even though I could have been like, okay, it's his problem, I didn't do anything wrong. As a leader, I said, you know what, Ash, you dropped the ball. It was up to me to reiterate on the first day, maybe not second and third and fourth day, but then in the first week and in the first month and the first quarter and the first year, that like he had an obligation, a responsibility, as I did, to work on communication. And if not to me, just to others. And so I feel like too many leaders in the corporate landscape, whether it's startup, and now startups are like corporations. More people work for Google than they do for Ford, So I feel like we absolutely need leaders who are going to be a bit like those good coaches. Now, a good coach will sometimes bench a player. You don't pass, you make the same mistakes, you don't show up to practice, hat tip, Allen Iverson, you're going to have to, there's going to be some kind of negative conditioning, at most some punishment, right? It's not good to say, but that's part of coaching. But we kind of have abdicated on both sides of the ball. On the one hand, we just don't talk about feelings. We don't talk about these things. But then on the other hand, the second you actually have the audacity to tell somebody, hey, you're not meeting our standards, this is not acceptable, then it's like you're being too tough. So there's a healthy balance there between being an effective leader that doesn't just sugarcoat everything. No, but not everybody needs to touch the ball before we take a shot on net. But I feel like the best leaders are going to be the ones that are almost like, psychologists meet coach. And one of the reasons for that is because I actually look to, I'm 43. I don't look at 25-year-olds and go, kids are dumb. They don't get it. I'm like, no, I'm like, they're learning. They're figuring out what matters to them. But because they've grown up with technology, they're very much quicker learners in many ways. But I also feel like they're more accepting, they're more tolerant, like as the world evolves, like 50 years ago, you had the civil rights movements, and Black Americans stood up. And then you had like gays and feminism and LGBTQ now. So I do feel like we're going to find ourselves in this middle ground where we are going to probably, like the best leaders figure out what the top skills are of every individual and then build around that.
Absolutely. You've talked about a lot of sort of trends that are currently happening and that are about to happen. We've talked about resilience. We've talked about conscious capitalism, self-awareness, and leadership. With a lot of my other guests, we talk about acceleration from COVID. To close out the podcast, what are some other predictions you have? They can either be business, they could be leadership, they could be marketing. What are some other things you think my audience would like to know? Because it does seem like you've hit the nail on the head with some of your predictions in the past.
Well, everybody's lucky, and even a broken clock is right twice per day. But thank you for that. I would just say that most of us and most of the people that are listening to your podcast are actually early adopters. It's all relative. Like, within the group, there are some who are more savvy and quicker learners. That I get. But we sometimes take things for granted. The first, millions of people who, for example, went out and worked on the internet, many of them gave up and many of them kind of retreated and said, hey, this doesn't work when the dot-com bubble burst. But those who toughed it out probably are further ahead in their development because just technology, they rode that wave. So the only thing that I would say is we've seen a tremendous amount of change over the last few decades due to computers, the internet, World Wide Web, mobile, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of those great ideas were actually maybe premature. So we haven't had time to digest most of those changes. There's just too much change. You know what I mean? Like even just communication. So my sentiment is what you're going to see is over the next decade, partly because of COVID accelerating the transformation, a lot of people who have been kind of left behind, they will be catching up. And that will just mean more like online shoppers and more online consumers still and more online advertising as TV dollars come forward. But the paradox of it all is some of the best ideas that are going to go on to become billion-dollar businesses are things that somebody tried 5 years ago or 10 years ago, but it was just the timing was off. So if you're listening to this and are kind of either an entrepreneur or you're yearning to launch your own thing, you don't need to necessarily create this shiny new toy that is so leading edge that, again, is going to be premature. You ultimately want to start off with your comparative advantage. What is that one thing that you are better than most people? And then two, figuring out where demand and supply is going to be in a couple of years. And then just kind of like figuring out a way to pursue that dream. And you'll probably find your course of success yourself.
Ash, I just wanted to thank you again for being on the show. I don't know that I was anticipating so much conversation around the human elements of business and entrepreneurship, but I'm so grateful that we went there because I think these aspects are so important. I'm going to go ahead and leave more information about your amazing work, including your books, articles, and films in the show notes. Thanks so much again.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get this podcast. And follow us on social media for top marketing tips from our guests.